Let's start with lesson number 2, and this means that we talk about the management consulting industry. And I would like to start with the history of management consulting, because I think it's always very useful that if you want to understand the present, that you take a look at the past and really try to understand where an industry comes from. And the beginning of management consulting is actually in the age of industrialization. Okay, so this means that roughly in the 1880s, the first management consulting or consultants came up, because back then it was more like solo consultants and very small firms, and the need was basically that they wanted to improve efficiency in all of those factories. So if you think about those large steel corporations or automotive corporations that came up at the late 19th century, then this is basically what consultants did back then. So they really had a very strong focus on processes and efficiency increase in those factories. The next big eras started roughly in the 60s, and this was the era of strategy consulting, because after World War II there was a global or economic expansion, and we really saw the beginning of globalization. And this meant that for many companies they faced new strategic challenges, and it became much more important, or even more and more important, not only to be or have the most competitive cost structure, but also to make the right strategic moves. And this is where companies, well-known companies like McKinsey, BCG and Bain and other strategy firms really started to grow and started to open a new market for them. Then the third era was roughly in the 1980s. So in this area, corporates became much more global and much more complex. Also, IT systems became much more important, because you know that the entire IT industry was also heavily growing, and ERP systems and stuff like that became a really core component of each company. And that created a need for complexity reduction or operations consulting. So this means that corporates or companies really try to improve their organizational structures, they try to improve their operations. So this means that they again become more efficient, and also they try to use technology in the right way to again become efficient and more productive. Then roughly in the 2000s, a new era started, and this was the era of specialization. So this means that more and more niche players came up, like for example companies that only focus on functional excellence in controlling or functional excellence in marketing, because as corporates became larger and larger, and as consulting as an industry also became much more known and kind of normal in corporates, there was also an increasing need in each department of a company to improve themselves. And now we are also in a new era, and I call this the era of transformation. And now we are facing many new factors that might change the industry. So first of all, there's a huge trend towards digitization, of course. So using digital tools and making or developing new digital business models and stuff becomes much more important, or became more important over the past years. Also, the topic of sustainability might be a huge game changer for the consulting industry. And a third factor might be all those new opportunities that we now have with data analytics. So we have much more powerful tools now to analyze companies, to use data, and I think this will also be a huge game changer in the consulting industry. So I don't know exactly where this is going, but we can say that we are now in an age of transformation in the consulting industry, and this means that we have very, very exciting times ahead. Let me continue with talking about the management consulting industry. So if we take a look at the consulting market, so at the global revenues, we see that the industry is constantly growing. Over the past years, we had a compound annual growth rate of roughly 5%. So this means that we have a steady and moderate growth rate in the consulting industry. Obviously, it's not growing as fast as the technology sector, but it's also not a declining market. So I think it's a pretty healthy market environment that we are in. Also, there is always the big question, what kind of economic situation is best for management consulting? So people are asking, is it better for the consulting industry if companies are growing and if there is an economic upswing, or if it's better if there's an economic downturn and companies need to restructure themselves? The answer is both economic situations are great. And we see that also here in the graph, because between 2011 and 2019 we only had almost only had an economic upturn, and this also kind of was a big driver for revenues in the consulting industry. But also we now are in a situation of an economic downturn, and still consulting revenues are growing. Because the argument is very simple. If there is an economic upswing, this means that money is available, that companies have the money to invest in themselves, and that they have the money to hire new consultants. Also, if there is a downturn, companies invest the money or have to invest the money to restructure themselves and become profitable again. There's only one situation that is really bad for the management consulting industry, and this is what happened 2020 with the global pandemic. And this is a situation or an era of insecurity. So if companies don't know what happens, if they don't know if we have an economic upswing or if we have a downturn, what they do what they always do is that they keep their cash very tight, and the first cost position that they usually try to save is the cost for external workforce. So usually this is the time where consultancies have a much harder time. With that being said, let's take a look at the global distribution of revenues in the consulting industry. So obviously consulting is a business that is very heavily active or driven by revenue in North America, so this is no surprise. Second is Europe, but we also see rapid growth in other areas like, for example, Asia Pacific, Middle East, or also Africa. So let's take a look at the most common consulting clusters. So the first cluster I like to talk about is the strategy consulting cluster. So there we have the most prestigious firms like McKinsey, BCG, and Bain. We also have some smaller players like Stern Stewart, for example, and Carney and Oliver Wyman, and many other strategy consultancies. And those companies, we talked in lesson number 1 about what management consultants do, and as you remember, they solve problems. And those companies usually try to solve strategy related problems. So this means that they try to increase revenue, they try to reduce costs, or they do organizational improvement. Well, this is mainly their focus, but this doesn't mean that they don't do things besides that, okay? Especially strategy consultancies are increasingly doing operational projects as well, but as a broad categorization, we can say that those strategy firms mainly try to solve strategy-related problems. Then the second big bucket are the big 4, okay? And those are the big global advisory firms. They are known as KPMG, Deloitte, PwC, and Ernst & Young or EY. There are many more advisory firms that also do or offer consulting services. And those companies mainly are focused on finance-related problems or operational problems. Okay, so for example, they try to advise in terms of accounting or processes. They also focus on IT transformation or finance transformation. Those are only examples, of course. Those companies do much more, but as a broad clustering, we can say that the big 4 advisory firms, that they focus on finance related problems. Then the third big bucket are the technology consulting firms, for example, Accenture or Capgemini. And those firms usually try to solve technology-related problems. So for example, if corporates implement large new IT systems, they hire such firms. Also, if they have more operational, automation or digitization projects, they also hire them. Or for example, if they do UX or UI, so user experience or user interfaces topics, this might also be something for technology firms. Again, this is just those are just examples, and of course those firms also do much more, but as a broad clustering we can say that they focus on technology related problems. And then as a fourth cluster you have all of those very specialized firms, and as an example, Simon Kucher in Germany, they are focused on pricing, for example, and marketing. And Horvath & Partners is also a German firm, very well known for their controlling excellence. And there are hundreds of consultancies that are in that specialized sector. There are some companies specialized in sustainability, some in product development, some in M&A deal advisory. So there are various topics that those companies can do. So this sector is very broad. So with that being said, I hope this gave you a very good overview of the consulting industry. Of course, we could do a deep dive in each of those categories, but the main goal here is to give you a broad overview. And that was lesson number 2 about the management consulting industry.